Hello and welcome to Cruising Through History with Scott Cruz. I'm Xander with Kenosha Public Library. Scott, what are we cruising through today?
Well, today, Xander, I'm going to talk about how the use of mustard gas led to breakthroughs in chemotherapy for certain types of cancers.
So mustard gas is like a chemical weapon, right?
Yes.
And that became a medical treatment.
Yes.
All right. Firstly, that seems weird that something used in the military became cancer treatment. So describe mustard gas for me.
Okay, mustard gas was originally used in World War I as just what it says, a gas.
Mm-hmm.
So you would have these canisters and you would release it and then it would blow. This is in the later stages of World War I. And I think there was such a stalemate at the front, they were trying anything. So you open the canister, the gas blows, and actually you can see it start to go across the field. It's very slow moving.
Yeah.
So people would put their gas masks on, and sometimes the gas masks weren't enough. They would penetrate,
mm-hmm.
or they didn't have time, and so it would cause a lot of eye irritation, scarring of the lungs, which was the biggest killer, actually. The problem with it was if the wind blew the other way, it blew it on your own troops. And another problem with mustard gas in World War I was that it would stay in the ground.
Oh.
So it would rise at certain times when you weren't expecting it, so you couldn't put your mask on. Now that was the mustard gas that was used in World War I. And even after World War I, there was some inkling that, well, this might be able to be used because some people had noticed that it would kill certain cells.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't until this incident that happened during World War II with a different type of mustard, I guess we'll call it gas for the sake of argument, that one person, a doctor who worked for the U.S. Army, he noticed and he started doing more not experimentation, but he started to look at blood work from victims and things of that nature and started to really figure this out. So it had been kind of known before. I mean, I think they tried it 1919, 1931, but because it had such a stigma, it didn't go very far.
Well, yeah, it's chemical warfare.
Yeah,
this is what we're. And I was looking at some stuff and I was like, whoa, people did not like chemical warfare.
No, they didn't. And so it all started December 2nd, 1943. There was a bunch of ships were moored in Bari Harbor in Italy. Now, Bari is on the ankle of Italy, I guess. It's north of the heel on the Adriatic Sea, so it's on the east side of Italy. And actually, a lot of the journalists there called it a little Pearl Harbor because the Germans had come in and they bombed all the ships.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it wasn't until later they noticed a lot of the victims, they were rescued, but yet somehow they were getting sick. They had eye irritation and they had all these other symptoms that if you knew it, you would think they were suffering from a gas attack.
Yeah.
And in this case, it was actually called liquid mustard gas or sulfur mustard. And when they went into the water, the mixture of the oil and the gas in its liquid form penetrated their skin.
It made its own it was almost, I don't want to say naturally occurring, but just because the mix of what was going on made its own mustard gas.
Right. Well, there were mustard gas, and there was 2,000 mustard gas bombs that were on the USS John Harvey. Now, it wasn't discovered till later that that's what it was.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, someone may be saying, well, Scott, why on earth did the John Harvey have 200 mustard bombs on it? Well, the reason is because the rumors were flying around that Hitler was going to resort to chemical warfare when the Allies invaded Italy. They had already come through Sicily. So if our listeners can probably know that, so if you're coming through North Africa to Sicily and then Italy, you're going up into Europe.
Yep.
So there was a lot of, and actually the taking of Italy took a little bit longer than they thought. It was more bloody than they thought it would be. The Germans are very persistent fighters there. So, yeah, so that's why it was there. Now, the problem also is when people went to rescue people out of the water,
they'd contaminate themselves.
They did,
right?
because when you got them on a ship and because no one knew what they were dealing with, that mixture got on the ship, other people were contaminated by it.
And that's part of why people hate chemical warfare. You don't know, right?
Right.
It's just...
So the Army had sent a man out named Dr. Stuart Alexander, and he was lieutenant colonel.
Okay.
He served in the Chemical Warfare Service, and then in the United States at the beginning of World War II, and then he was sent to North Africa. So he was sent out to investigate all this stuff.
Okay.
And he was the one who kept saying, this looks like a mustard gas that we're dealing with. Now, because it was top secret, no one had informed the medical authorities in Bari that this is what they were dealing with. So some of the victims, or actually most of them, didn't get the treatment they should have gotten because people, officers and people higher up were more concerned with protecting the secret. Of course, it doesn't mention what would have happened if the ship sank, thank God, because if the ship blew up,
oh, it would have just released.
It would have rained
that
all
wind.
that on, and there were civilians who were killed in this too.
Yeah, and that would have just been uncontrollable.
It would have rained on the city of Bart. So, yeah, this
it's a new definition of acid rain.
Right. So that happened, and so Dr. Alexander, he wrote up his report. He sent it in. And he gave his recommendation that this is what we were dealing with. And it was Winston Churchill who actually cabled his superiors and said, tell them to amend this medical report because it's not mustard gas. It's he called it burns due to enemy action. So that's just, which is almost the same thing. So I guess you can say they weren't admitting it.
Yeah, but it sounds like they're trying to hide something because like that could be whatever. But the news reports are like, well, we can't say it's mustard gas. We don't want to look bad.
Right. And even before the Bari attack, the first patient that they had not experimented because the patient did consent. So I guess it was experimental drug at the time. Was right before this in 1942. Now the patient had passed away, but they were already in an advanced form. And I think it was always, with any chemotherapies in those early days, it was always, if you gave too much to a patient, you could kill them because you were trying to balance that out.
So yeah, let's talk about, because so we got an understanding more mustard gas, but becoming chemotherapy, like they don't just like, get a syringe and inject direct mustard gas into your bloodstream. Like what?
Right. There were some, I think it was forms of it. So they took this sulfur mustard, which was different than the World War I mustard.
Okay.
And even Dr. Alexander had noticed that it was destroying white blood cells. So then he thought, and it also would suppress the division of cells in the bone marrow and the immune system. So that's how this came about.
So really, he was like, it's doing this. I wonder if that would work against cancer.
Yes.
Because cancer is like the multiplication of cells like uncontrollably, like in a spot that they shouldn't be doing that, right?
Yes.
So if they have this in mustard gas starting to mess with cells reproduction, could potentially reverse something like that. And is that how that came up?
Yes. And so I don't want to, I can tell our listeners I'm not a doctor. So a lot of this knowledge has come to me from reading. But yes, that was the point, that he noticed it would suppress cells. And so if it could do that, maybe it could, in certain amounts. Yeah, you're right. They weren't taking mustard and injecting it into people. They were taking certain forms of it and trying to figure out. Now, the reason it took off with Dr. Stewart, with Dr. Alexander, was because his superior was a man named Cornelius Rhodes, who was a colonel at the time, who had also served in the Chemical Warfare Service, who was also a hematologist. So he looked at all this reporting that Dr. Alexander had done.
And hematology is like blood, looking at blood.
Yes,
right?
yes, study of blood diseases.
Okay.
And so, And he was thinking, yeah, there's something here. Now, the reason that's significant is because in 1948, Cornelius Rhoads became the head of the Sloan Kettering Cancer Institute in New York City.
Okay.
And that was opened. And so that's when they started doing the experimental, more of the experimental stuff on patients.
Yeah, on patients. So, but did the patients know that this was there's essentially, it wasn't mustard gas, but it's derived from mustard gas.
Right, I don't think they were told that. I think they were told that there was this new experimental drug that they could try. Now, one of the most famous people who tried this was Babe Ruth.
Really? Babe Ruth?
The baseball player.
Like the baseball, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Because as people know, in the late 40s, he was suffering from a rare form of cancer of the throat, in the larynx and whatnot. And so he volunteered. They told him, we have this thing, and it's not a cure, but it could extend your life longer than we think right now.
Okay.
And so they gave it to him. He said, okay, give it to me, and they did. And it worked for a while, but they started to notice this with other patients too. They would always have good results right away, but then it would start to wear off, and then they would have relapses.
Remission,
yeah, there'd be some remission, but not fully. And so I guess that's what they had to keep working on. Now, yes, it does bring up some ethical questions.
Yeah, it's like, did they not tell them that, this is this compound? They're just like, new drug, here, try it.
Right.
That doesn't seem very informed for informed
and
consent.
even within the medical community, there was, at that time, now we're talking the late 1940s, we're so far from that right now, but even in the medical community at the time, there was division. There was talk of, well, the people that were coming up with the new drugs and they were trying it out on patients were saying, listen, if we tell someone there's no hope, that's not what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to try to help them. Whereas other doctors had said, no, if there's no hope, we're not going to do a bunch of things if it's just going to prolong the agony, if you will.
Yeah, this is before like FDA approval, or is this like around that time for like experimentation?
I think it was there at the time.
Okay.
Now I got a lot of this information from a very excellent book called The Great Secret by Jeanette Conant, and it's ironic because I've read many books on World War II. I mean, I don't even know, more than 50, probably more. And I've never encountered this incident ever in anything I read. And I was reading a book called The Day of Battle by Rick Atkinson, which is actually a really good book on the Allied invasion of Sicily and Italy. And he had like a paragraph on it, and it just caught my attention. Like, what? I never knew any of this happened. And well, of course, because it was kept a secret, sort of. The British kept the secret. The Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army finally in 1944 admitted that was on the ship. And they said why it was on there, and that they never intended to use it, only in defense. So if Hitler would have used it, then they would have used it.
We're getting the beginnings of mutually assured destruction.
Kind of on a smaller scale, but yes. Yeah, so when Cornelius Rhoads, when he became the head of Sloan Kettering, that's what sort of got this all moving. And but the British, they kept the lid on it for a long time. In fact, because people, when you had World War II veterans who were applying for their pensions that weren't getting them because it was claimed, well, you weren't injured by gas or something. There was some snafu or something, which is also from World War II, that phrase, or that word. And we won't go into what it means. It was 1985, I think, was the first time they recognized a veteran who had been injured this way. I mean, that's a long way.
And that's a lot of, I'm just thinking, that's a lot of experimentation between its first use in the type of mustard gas from World War One to 1985, where they're just like, yeah, it was from mustard gas.
Right.
How?
In fact, when this was still going on, I mean, and Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Alexander would probably have been lost to history because, funny enough, when he was out of the Army, he was offered a job at Sloan Kettering from Cornelius Rhodes, but he had promised his father he would go back to New Jersey and practice medicine in the family practice, which he did for the rest of his life. And the story kind of went away, which is odd to me that this story has gone away. But anyway, so this story kind of went away until, I believe, 1971. A man named Glenn Infield had taken his mother to a doctor because she was suffering from leukemia at the time.
Yep.
And he said, hey, the drug we're going to give you is derived from mustard gas.
They straight up said it?
Yeah. And so this Glenn Infield, he was a U.S. Air Force. He was out by then. But he said, really? So he started doing his own digging. Now the problem with his book is, his book came out in 1971. It caused kind of a stir. The problem is it's sort of like half fiction, half nonfiction, because he had to fill in a lot of gaps. Because of course there weren't a lot of documentation out there.
Not public documentation.
Right. And Stuart Alexander, he did contact him, and Alexander didn't really want to discuss it with him. He was very harsh on Eisenhower, and Alexander really liked Eisenhower and didn't want to badmouth him in any way. And so as we found out later, it was Eisenhower who, now we didn't know it at the time when he wrote this book, but it was Eisenhower who suggested going public with it and just getting it out there and just taking the lumps and being done with it. But Stuart Alexander is very interesting because he just did all this work and he almost disappeared from history if it hadn't been for a high school student.
A high school student.
Yes.
Out there in the youth looking around.
I mean, you talk about roads through history. I mean, that's not to play on the guy's name, but...
Or yours.
Or mine. When you cruise through history, if you will, you find all these little stories. And one is that, so there was a high school student in 1987. His name was Nicholas Spark, not the author.
I was about to say, Nicholas Sparks did he does more than just be an author? Like, okay.
Right, so it was Sparks singular. He had gone to a yard sale and he bought a whole collection of these old American heritage magazines. They were all bound together. And so he was reading an excerpt from this Infield's book about the Bari incident. And he thought, well, that'd be a great topic for my essay for National History Day at my high school.
Because that's how you get your essay topics, is going to a yard sale and picking up random books.
Yeah, any of our younger listeners won't really. He didn't go to the internet, as it were. And
or
so,
not even the public library, just a yard sale. That's where to get started.
And this guy's dad was a pathologist, so his dad was in the medical field. But what's really interesting about this kid is that he's not a kid now, but at the time he didn't like Infield's book. He thought it left too much so he contacted the Veterans Administration trying to get records of this Alexander.
Okay.
And so he did, there was St. Louis, Missouri is where some of the records are, a lot of the records are stored, but there was a fire there. But they did find an old personnel file for Stuart Alexander. It was sort of slightly damaged. It wasn't totally damaged, so that was usable. And so I guess this kid sent this Alexander a letter, and Stuart Alexander called him on the phone.
Like, legitimately called a high schooler
and
about records.
So you almost wouldn't believe this, but it's true. So what he did is he started to record the conversations between him. He went to Radio Shack, which no one's going to know what that is either, but he went to Radio Shack and he bought a phone recorder, and so he recorded these conversations. And Alexander, and then he did win the essay contest.
Of course.
And so Alexander thought, that's nice. So Alexander called him and congratulated him, but he didn't really want the spotlight. But that wasn't enough for this kid. So what he did is he contacted, at the time, one of the senators from Arizona was named Dennis DeConcini.
Okay.
So he contacted him and told him about all this. And then he thought it was wrong that no one had recognized Alexander for what really he contributed to medicine. And Alexander himself was fairly modest and didn't really think about it all that much. He was a family physician and a cardiologist. And so after about a couple of years, and maybe about a year later, 1988, they did honor Stuart Alexander in Congress. I just think if it hadn't been for that kid being so persistent, he might be lost history. And in fact, Alexander died in 1991, so not too long after he was honored, and that's how this story came about. But really, Jeanette Connett's book is the first book, book-length thing I've ever seen, except I never read Glenn Infield's book. I didn't even know it existed until I was researching for this topic. So, so there's those little highways and byways. I don't want to get too schmaltzy with that, but
Oh my gosh, Scott! Today you're on a roll.
So that's how that all came about, and it's really interesting because my mother has leukemia, and so she's being treated now. Mm-hmm. And they were doing something on her that was not experimental, but it wasn't even a chemotherapy; it was a pill. Mm-hmm. Now she had to stop taking it because of certain side effects, but still, I'm thinking a pill. Now there's different forms of leukemia. Hers isn't as virulent as some of the other ones, which are harder to treat. But I think about that, how it wrapped up with this whole story. Even I sort of stumbled on this by accident.
Yeah.
I never knew it, and I'm thinking, how could that not have gotten into anything? And even in 1987, when the senator's office had started investigating this, because they needed to clear all this stuff before they could give this award to Dr. Alexander, the British were still saying, no, well, we don't know if it was that, and until finally they admitted. There's a line in her book that's kind of funny. It's kind of clever too, because she says that it wasn't Winston Churchill's finest hour, and I know it's kind of dopey, but it's kind of funny too. But they finally said that, well, given everything that was going on, and I guess there's a little truth to that, because in December of '42 you had the Germans were bogged down in Russia. Mm-hmm. The Pacific War was rolling with battles in Guadalcanal, and so this whole World War was really going then. And so, but I don't know. Churchill probably had his reasons, but I don't know if it was to not. But the funny thing is, if it was not to have the Germans find out that we had this, they knew it anyway. They found it out. So that's not to me surprising, given that I'm sure there were plenty of, even though Italy immediately surrendered, I'm sure that there were still plenty of partisans that were probably sympathetic to the fascists, or even there were plenty of Germans that were in Italy too at the time.
Well, it's also there's got to be a bit of a morale factor there, because you're talking about who has the moral high ground a lot of the time, and and chemical weapons I don't think they were banned at this point, but they were still looked down upon.
Yes, which is why they were never used again after World War I. But you made an interesting point. Their use was banned, but their production wasn't, if you can sort of follow this. It was in 1925, there was a Geneva Protocol. Mm-hmm. Oh, I know. It banned the use, but not the possession of chemical or biological weapons in war, which tells me that.
Just don't tell us about it.
Well, how are you if you're producing them for a reason? Yes, for defense reasons.
Yeah.
But you're still producing them for a reason.
But just don't tell anybody about it.
Right.
Just don't use it unless you're using it as part of an experiment or trying to find out if it can help with cancer.
Right. If the Luftwaffe never bombed Bari Harbor, we never would have known. I'm sure that John Harvey would have just sailed away without nobody ever knowing that.
It would just be one of those classified military secrets.
Yes.
Just something.
And who knows? There could have been other incidents too, but we just don't know.
Yeah.
And we may not know for another 100 years or 50 years.
We may be thinking of classified. Of veterans just we just hear stories from veterans on they were denied something for something and they don't know why, and someone would eventually, I'd imagine, put the dots together.
They did.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the medical personnel put the dots together right away. But they kept saying, "Oh no, it's not that." So, and then how they were treating them was just making it worse. So let's say I'm covered in this whatever.
This drenched suit and mustard gas that just got
And
absorbed.
And a lot of them sat in their clothes for like 24 hours.
Yep.
They had blankets thrown over them, so that just increased the penetration into the. And it was all by the skin. It was all through the skin. That's how this all came about. So yeah, it's pretty interesting when you think about it. In some ways, it's interesting. In other ways, it's sort of horrifying.
I'm just thinking, and it penetrating the skin, and then eventually you had it directly injected into your blood. Like now we go full circle back to that point, but a different version. I mean, it wasn't exactly the sulfur mustard.
It was, and I don't know the chemical breakdown of these things, but
yeah, I tried looking it up.
It was something in it was how they sort of. They got to this point where they said, this is the thing that will. Yeah. And I do believe in 1948, Alexander Haddow, who was a chemist in the UK, and he did publish a study showing which parts of nitrogen mustard were necessary for its cancer-killing properties. So the work continued here and in the UK, even though in the UK it was kind of classified for a long time. That work continued, so.
Yeah, for any aspiring chemists out there, I think your homework assignment is to look up the chemical composition of mustard gas as a chemotherapy treatment, and just try saying it, and just remember all those little tips of saying what each that combo.
And some of our listeners may even be aware. I mean, chlorambucil was a drug that is still in use. It was approved in 1957. And it's used for chronic lymphocytic leukemia.
Is that a mustard gas one?
And there's one called Mustargin.
They're not really trying to hide, are they?
I looked both of these up in Google. They're still used. And Mustargin is a nitrogen mustard still employed as a chemotherapeutic for several cancers, including lymphosarcoma and some types of leukemia. Wow. So it's still, just think though, at least out of something horrifying, something good had come, as opposed to some of the other things that have popped up in history, and in World War II. And when you mentioned moral high ground, there's still some of that too, about firebombing and nuclear bombing, those kind of things, So, but at least out of this, something was able to grow that actually helped people. There were some stops and starts, and Cornelius Rhodes himself isn't a very sympathetic character either. He has his own. He's kind of controversial, and for some of the things he was doing when he was working in Puerto Rico in the 1930s, and so those things came out when he became head of the hospital, and then I think he passed away in the late 50s. But so I mean, at least out of something terrible, this happened.
Yeah. So. At least something came out of it throughout the experimentation, the morality, all of that stuff. Something came out of it that we were like, okay.
But most of the people weren't forced. I mean, they did volunteer. Babe Ruth is like the most famous of them, but still.
All right, thank you, Scott. So, Scott, do you have an idea of what we're talking about next year? What next time? What are we cruising through?
Well, I'm going to talk about. I don't think anybody would believe that they tried to use a submarine during the American Revolution.
The American Revolution.
The American Revolution, 1776.
Okay. We'll have to figure out how that happened next time, because that's, I don't think the technology was there, so.
No, but it is an interesting story.
Okay. Well, thank you, and thank you for joining us, listeners. We will cruise through some more history next time.
Thank you, Xander.